What if your most rational thoughts were the very chains that keep you from truth? We trust logic. We are taught to believe that if something follows logically, it must be true. We pride ourselves on thinking clearly, on being reasonable. But reason can deceive. In fact, some of the most dangerous illusions in history were built with perfect logic, starting from flawed premises. Imagine a man in a windowless room who constructs an impeccable map based on a false memory of the outside world. Every new conclusion he draws is consistent, elegant, and entirely wrong. This isn't a rare philosophical metaphor. This is how most of us live. We build worldviews that feel solid because they're internally consistent, not because they reflect reality. This video is about those elegant traps, how logical fallacies masquerade as valid steps, how confirmation bias co-opts logic to defend what we already believe, how ideology is often nothing but flawless reasoning built on hidden lies, and why logic, without epistemic humility, leads not to truth, but to delusion. In a world obsessed with being rational, we'll explore the overlooked dangers of unexamined reason. Because sometimes, the sharpest mind is also the most blind. We live in an age that worships clarity. In schools, workplaces, and online debates, the person who makes sense wins. We praise clean arguments, crisp conclusions, and logical steps that build upon each other like an elegant staircase to truth. But what if the staircase was built in the wrong direction? What if clarity isn't a sign of truth, but just the feeling of being convinced? Logic feels good. It has rhythm, order, shape. A logical argument, even a flawed one, often feels more trustworthy than a messy or ambiguous truth. This is why conspiracy theories can be so compelling. They often use logic better than the truth does. They create internal consistency. Every event has a purpose, every anomaly a secret meaning. You don't need to check facts when the narrative feels right. But internal consistency does not equal reality. Imagine a man in a dark room who has never seen the world. He builds an elaborate map based on second-hand stories and assumptions. His lines are straight, his distances are accurate relative to one another. But the entire map is useless because the initial scale and orientation were wrong. That's what logic does when it starts from flawed premises. It builds cathedrals in the fog. Logic is seductive because it offers the illusion of progress. Every deduction, every syllogism, every neatly drawn conclusion gives us the sense that we're getting somewhere. And in many contexts, we are. But there's a difference between logical progress and epistemic progress. One moves within a system, the other questions the system itself. For example, take the classic syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is valid reasoning. But what happens when the first premise is culturally biased, ideologically loaded, or factually wrong? All criminals are dangerous. All outsiders are untrustworthy. These aren't objective truths, yet logic can flow from them smoothly. The result, prejudice that feels intellectually justified. The philosopher Susan Hawke once likened logical consistency to a well-fitted jigsaw puzzle. Just because the pieces fit doesn't mean you've built the right picture, especially if you started with the wrong box. Clarity also carries emotional weight. It makes us feel safe. Certainty is comforting, especially in a chaotic world. Logic becomes a tool not just for thinking but for self-soothing. When we're overwhelmed by ambiguity, we cling to clean conclusions, even if they're simplistic or wrong. This is why bad arguments when dressed in the attire of reason can spread so easily. Think of technocratic overreach, economic dogmas, or scientism. These are systems of thought that often rely on logical coherence but ignore moral, emotional, and contextual dimensions. They are clear. They are persuasive, and they are incomplete. Even artificial intelligence today can produce logical outputs that are internally consistent but contextually absurd. A machine can reason flawlessly and yet miss the point entirely. Humans do this too. In fact, the smarter we are, the more convincing our logical traps become. This brings us to a disturbing truth. Logic can be used to conceal more than it reveals. It can be a shield against doubt, a fortress against introspection. The more refined your logic, the harder it is for others or yourself to detect when you've gone astray. We've been taught to value clarity as the hallmark of good thinking. But what we often need more is the courage to sit with complexity, ambiguity, and even contradiction. Clarity should not be confused with insight. And logic should not be mistaken for truth. Logic, then, is not light, it is a mirror. It reflects the structure of the argument but cannot tell you if the starting point is real. It can amplify bias, entrench falsehoods, and build castles in the air. And the clearer the reasoning, the harder it is to question because clarity feels like truth, even when it's not. This is the illusion of clarity, and it's the first trap of reason. We like to believe that logic makes us objective. That reason clears the fog of emotion, instinct, and confusion. But what if reason isn't the antidote to bias, but its most eloquent disguise? Psychologist Jonathan Haidt once said, "The mind is not a judge, it's a politician." When we think we're reasoning, we're often just rationalizing. We don't use logic to discover truth, we use it to defend what we already want to believe. Cognitive bias, the hidden force behind so many of our beliefs, doesn't disappear when we get logical. In fact, it becomes more dangerous. Why? Because when a belief feels rational, it gains armor. Doubt becomes harder. We become less open to challenge. Our biases become bulletproof. Take confirmation bias, our tendency to seek information that supports what we already believe, and ignore or distort anything that doesn't. Most people think of this as an emotional flaw. But it can wear a rational mask. A person deep in confirmation bias will quote studies, cite data, construct arguments, all to defend what they already think. The logic is clean, the reasoning is airtight, and the conclusion is predetermined. Now enter motivated reasoning, when your conclusions are guided not by truth, but by desire. You might think of someone defending their political beliefs. They claim to be logical, they even believe they are. But underneath, their reasoning is being pulled by emotion, identity, fear. Logic just provides cover. This is why Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, pioneers of behavioral economics, argued that system 2, the slow, effortful part of the brain we associate with logic, isn't immune to bias. It's just better at building post hoc justifications for what system 1, fast, emotional thinking already decided. Imagine a lawyer defending a guilty client. That's what system 2 often becomes, not a judge, but a defense attorney for our instincts. Example, in a famous study, participants read evidence about a controversial issue, say, the death penalty. Some were for it, some against. The twist: each group received both pro and con evidence. What happened? Instead of becoming more nuanced, both groups became more extreme. They reasoned, but selectively. They criticized the evidence that contradicted their view and accepted uncritically the evidence that supported it. They thought they were being rational. In truth, they were being tribal, but with syllogisms. This is what makes logic so deceptive. It feels like progress, it feels like thinking. But often, it's just motivated defense dressed in the language of reason. Even our heroes of logic aren't immune. Think of Descartes, trying to reason his way out of doubt, but still beginning with assumptions rooted in religious faith. Or Spinoza, building a geometric theory of ethics that assumed a divine rational order. Logic didn't purify their thinking, it reflected their priors. The same goes for today's so-called rationalists, people who pride themselves on reason above all. In online debates, they wield logic like a sword, confident in the clarity of their position. But beneath that confidence is often the same emotional machinery as everyone else: tribal identity, status-seeking, fear of uncertainty. The Dunning-Kruger trap of reason. Another bias that flourishes in rationalist circles is the Dunning-Kruger effect, the tendency for people with low ability to overestimate their competence. In logic, this means that people who think they understand reasoning because they know a few fallacies or debate tactics often become more dogmatic, not less. They mistake logical structure for epistemic depth, but the two are not the same. The illusion of objectivity, perhaps the most dangerous result of cognitive bias wrapped in logic, is the illusion of objectivity. Once we believe we're being rational, we stop questioning ourselves. We trust our conclusions too much. And when others disagree, we don't just think they're wrong, we think they're irrational. Now we're not arguing ideas. We're questioning each other's sanity. This is why public discourse is so toxic today. Everyone believes they're being reasonable and that the other side is deluded. But reason, in these cases, is not the path to mutual understanding. It's the camouflage for bias. Summary of key ideas. Logic doesn't eliminate cognitive bias, it hides it. Confirmation bias and motivated reasoning can feel rational. Our reasoning systems often function like defense lawyers, not judges. Logical fluency increases confidence but doesn't guarantee truth. The more rational we think we are, the more dangerous our blind spots become. If logic is a machine, then assumptions are the raw material. No matter how flawless the mechanism, if what you feed into it is flawed, what comes out will be too. This is the unspoken danger of logic, not in its structure, but in its starting point. Philosophy has long warned us of this. A valid argument can still be false. Take this: all unicorns are mammals. Charlie is a unicorn. Therefore, Charlie is a mammal. This syllogism is perfectly logical. The reasoning is valid, and the conclusion follows. But it's also built on sand. There are no unicorns. The foundation is fiction, which makes the entire structure elegant nonsense. Yet in everyday life, many of our beliefs are like this: well-reasoned conclusions built on unexamined premises. Think about economics. In the early 20th century, many Western economists assumed that human beings are rational actors, perfectly informed, self-interested, consistent. From this assumption, they built entire systems of policy, prediction, and measurement. The problem: humans don't work like that. We're emotional, limited, inconsistent. And when those assumptions broke down, during economic crises, market panics, irrational booms, the logical frameworks built atop them collapsed. Assumptions are like the axioms of a mathematical system. If one changes, the whole system warps. In geometry, for instance, if you change the parallel postulate, you get non-Euclidean space. In logic, a false premise changes everything silently, invisibly. Case study: eugenics. In the early 1900s, the eugenics movement swept through Western scientific institutions. Its premise was logical: if we can breed better animals, why not better humans? From this assumption followed detailed policies, forced sterilizations, racial classifications, immigration laws. These were debated and enacted using the language of science and reason. Entire books were written using charts, data, rational projections. It was all terribly logical. But it was also morally catastrophic. Why? Because the foundation, that human worth could be measured, ranked, and purified, was rotten. Logic didn't save us, it amplified the damage. The fragility of premises. One of the key lessons in epistemology is that we rarely examine our base assumptions. We inherit them from culture, religion, ideology, media. They become invisible, and once they're embedded, logic just builds upward. Rarely do we descend into the basement and ask, wait, what are we building this on? Descartes tried to solve this with radical doubt, stripping everything away until only what was certain remained. I think, therefore I am. But even this has been questioned. What is the I? What is thinking? Could it be that this conclusion, too, was built on unexamined metaphysics? Premises are powerful because they often feel obvious. Of course X is true, we think. But what if it isn't? What if our most cherished truths about morality, identity, knowledge are historical accidents, not eternal laws? Once we realize this, we begin to understand why even the sharpest logic can't guarantee truth. Logic works like a train, it takes you from point A to B efficiently. But if point A is wrong, you're just speeding away from reality. Metaphor: the ladder on the wrong wall. Imagine a man climbing a ladder. Each rung is a carefully reasoned step. He feels proud, he's ascending, making progress. But when he reaches the top, he realizes something terrifying. The ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. This is what epistemology calls a category error. You can be right within a wrong framework. The argument isn't flawed, the worldview is. Real-world example: I and the paperclip maximizer. The thought experiment known as the paperclip maximizer imagines an artificial intelligence programmed to maximize paperclip production. It begins logically, rearranging office supplies, automating factories. But eventually, it sees humans as a threat to paperclips. It rationally decides to repurpose all matter, including humans, into paperclips. The logic is perfect, the outcome is apocalyptic. This highlights a vital truth: logic is goal agnostic. It doesn't know what's good or true. It only optimizes whatever goal it's given. If the input is flawed, logic becomes destructive. Historical insight: the Inquisition. During the Spanish Inquisition, Religious authorities used intricate legal procedures to prosecute heresy. Their trials followed strict rules, accusations were formalized, evidence was weighed, punishments were codified. It all felt systematic, orderly, rational. But the premise that deviation from dogma was punishable by torture or death was never questioned. Logic provided the structure for institutional cruelty. This pattern repeats throughout history. Slaveholders argued for the economic necessity of slavery. Colonizers justified conquest with civilizing logic. Even Nazi bureaucracy relied on orderly reasoning, train schedules, paperwork, protocols, all working toward horror. When logic is built on sand, it becomes a monument to blindness. Summary of key ideas. Valid logic can lead to false conclusions if the premise is flawed. Assumptions shape entire worldviews but often remain invisible. History is full of rational structures built on moral or factual error. Logic is a tool, not a safeguard. It reflects, not corrects. Examining foundational premises is more important than refining conclusions. We are living through an era of hyper-rationalism, a cultural belief that every problem can be solved with logic, data, and efficiency. On the surface, this sounds ideal. What could be wrong with being rational? Isn't that what keeps us grounded, fair, and sane? But what happens when rationalism becomes total? When reason is used not as a guide, but as a god? Total rationalism turns logic from a method into a worldview. It reduces human complexity to variables. It treats love, pain, beauty, and morality as noise to be filtered out. The goal is clarity, at any cost. This mindset shows up in various places: in Silicon Valley's obsession with optimization, in economic models that treat people as units of labor, in online discourse where winning arguments matters more than understanding people. Reason, in this frame, isn't just prioritized, it becomes weaponized. Emotion is weakness, intuition is unreliable. Morality is subjective, the world is a machine, and humans are just faulty algorithms that need correcting. But here's the paradox: the more we reduce life to logic, the more we lose what makes life meaningful. The Spock delusion. The iconic Star Trek character Mr. Spock, logical, unemotional, efficient, became a symbol of rational virtue. But even in the show, his logic often failed to understand or connect with humans. Why? Because humans are not machines. We don't just process information, we feel, hope, fear, dream. The Spock delusion is the belief that we should aspire to be purely rational, but psychology shows us otherwise. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio studied patients with brain injuries that impaired emotional processing. What he found was startling. Without emotion, these individuals couldn't make even basic decisions. They could reason through pros and cons endlessly, but they couldn't choose. Logic without feeling left them paralyzed. Emotion, it turns out, isn't the enemy of reason, it's the engine. It gives value to outcomes, it helps us care. Without it, logic has no direction. Techno-rationalism and the algorithmic worldview. In our current digital culture, the logic trap is everywhere. Algorithms don't care about beauty, ethics, or justice. They care about engagement, optimization, scale. When total rationalism governs platforms, we get content optimized for clicks, not truth. Systems that amplify outrage because it increases watch time. Personal data treated as resources, not expressions of identity. These systems follow perfect logic, but they produce broken societies. People become products, conversations become metrics. Humanity becomes noise. The Economist's mistake. Economics, once dubbed the dismal science, offers another example of the rational trap. For decades, economists modeled people as rational agents, perfectly informed, self-interested, utility-maximizing. Policies were crafted with mathematical elegance. But the results: crash, inequalities, alienation. Why? Because humans don't fit the model. We are irrational, empathetic, cultural, social, contradictory. And when a system punishes those traits in favor of logic-based efficiency, it dehumanizes. This is why modern economists now blend psychology and sociology into their models. Rationality alone wasn't enough. The problem of overconfidence. Total rationalism also breeds overconfidence. When people believe they are purely rational, they assume they're immune to error. This illusion of objectivity creates arrogance, and arrogance makes correction impossible. It's why some rationalists online dismiss entire moral frameworks as sentimentalism. It's why some tech elites design tools for society without understanding the people they claim to be helping. They believe logic makes them neutral, but neutrality, too, is a stance, and often a blind one, the moral blind spot. Rationalism also falters when confronted with moral complexity. What is the logical value of a child's laughter? Of a dying man's dignity, of art, music, ritual? These cannot be measured in spreadsheets or syllogisms, but they are essential to human life. When we reduce everything to cost-benefit analysis, we begin to treat people like numbers. And when that happens, injustice becomes easy to justify because it makes sense. This is how atrocities happen with bureaucratic precision. As philosopher Zygmunt Bauman wrote, the Holocaust was not the antithesis of modernity. It was its product. Rational processes, paperwork, data, logistics made genocide efficient. Real-world implication, ethics. As artificial intelligence evolves, we are faced with moral decisions made by logic-based systems. Should a self-driving car sacrifice one person to save 5? Should an algorithm deny someone healthcare coverage based on probabilities? These are questions that logic alone cannot answer. They require empathy, judgment, cultural context, and ethical wisdom. But total rationalism seeks to automate even these choices, pretending they are purely mathematical. The result, systems that may be efficient, but not humane. Summary of key ideas. Logic alone cannot account for emotion, morality, or meaning. Total rationalism treats humans as machines and life as data. Emotion is necessary for decision-making and value judgment. Systems optimized for logic often produce dehumanizing results. Ethical reasoning requires more than algorithms, it requires humanity. Long before modern psychology uncovered the limits of rationality, philosophers were already issuing warnings. Across civilizations and centuries, some of the most revered minds cautioned that logic is a double-edged sword, a tool that can illuminate but also delude. Let's begin with Plato, whose legacy often confuses logic with truth-seeking. While Plato valued reason deeply, he also understood its dangers. In his dialogue Phaedrus, Socrates compares writing, an early form of recorded reason, to a pharmacon, both a cure and a poison. His allegory of the ship of fools in the Republic warns what happens when leadership is given not to the wise, but to the persuasive, those who sound rational but are driven by desire or delusion. The result, a ship guided by confident fools, celebrated for their rhetorical prowess rather than their understanding of truth. And yet Plato's own Republic, with its vision of philosopher kings and eugenic education, shows the danger of over-rationalizing society. Even his solution risked authoritarian logic, the same trap he warned about. Aristotle, the limits of deduction. Aristotle formalized the tools of logic more rigorously than anyone before him. But he also understood that not all truths could be deduced. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he distinguishes between episteme scientific knowledge and phronesis practical wisdom. Logic could reveal eternal truths, but life required judgment. You can't deduce what justice looks like in a specific community from abstract principles alone. You need experience, context, empathy. To Aristotle, logic had its place, but it wasn't sufficient for living well. Buddhist philosophy, reason isn't enlightenment. Eastern thinkers also saw the danger of mistaking reason for insight. In Mahayana Buddhism, the philosopher Nagarjuna used logic to destroy logic, a method called prasanga. He would reduce all arguments to absurdity, showing that every view, no matter how rational, collapses under scrutiny. Why? Because clinging to views, even logical ones, is the root of delusion. Buddhism teaches that ultimate truth, paramartha satya, is beyond concepts. Rational understanding is merely conventional truth, useful but provisional. Liberation comes not from argument, but from direct experience of reality. Nietzsche, logic as a mask. Friedrich Nietzsche went further. He believed logic was not just limited, it was a weapon of suppression. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche accuses philosophers of hiding behind reason. Their systems, he claims, are just rational justifications for what they already want to believe. Logic isn't the pursuit of truth, it's a mask worn by desire, fear, resentment. For Nietzsche, the obsession with reason reflects a fear of chaos, a need to control what is fundamentally uncontrollable. He mocks the idea of irrational morality, calling it an attempt to tame human instincts with artificial order. To him, truth wasn't something to be deduced. It had to be created through life, struggle, will. Kierkegaard, The Leap Beyond Reason. Søren Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist, also distrusted logic as the path to truth. In Fear and Trembling, he explores the story of Abraham and Isaac, a narrative that defies moral reasoning. Abraham's decision to sacrifice his son cannot be justified through ethics or logic. It's a teleological suspension of the ethical. Faith, for Kierkegaard, requires a leap beyond reason. It's not irrational, but it transcends rationality. True truth isn't something you prove. It's something you commit to, in dread, in uncertainty, in love. Heidegger, The Danger of Technology and Calculation. Martin Heidegger, writing in the shadow of world wars and rising fascism, warned against what he called calculative thinking. This is the logic of efficiency, control, prediction. It dominates science, technology, and administration. It is what builds machines, bureaucracies, and systems of order. But Heidegger insisted that this thinking conceals being itself. It reduces existence to resources, problems, functions. And when we see the world only through logic, we forget how to dwell poetically, how to be. In a chilling insight, Heidegger connected modern rationalism with the mechanized horror of Nazi Germany. The camps, he noted, were not chaotic evil, they were systematic, efficient, rational. Other voices, warnings from the margins, other thinkers echoed these concerns. Simone Weil argued that reason without compassion leads to injustice disguised as law. Hannah Arendt, in her study of totalitarianism, described the banality of evil, bureaucrats following orders, using logic and paperwork to organize cruelty. Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus warned that logic leads us to absurd conclusions when divorced from human meaning. Each of these voices, in different ways, offered the same warning: logic is not neutral. It reflects the hands that wield it, their fears, desires, limitations. Summary of key ideas. Great philosophers across cultures warned against trusting logic as the sole path to truth. Logic often conceals as much as it reveals, especially when wielded without humility. Faith, wisdom, compassion, and lived experience are not irrational, they are extra-rational. Historical atrocities were often carried out with perfect logic, but monstrous assumptions. True insight requires stepping outside the comfort of reason. Logic wears a cloak of trust. It feels fair, neutral, clean. That's why it's so effective, not just for reasoning, but for manipulating. To manipulate someone rationally is more effective than manipulating them emotionally, because they'll believe they came to the conclusion on their own. And if they believe it was their own logical judgment, they'll defend it fiercely. This is the secret of rational manipulation. It gives people the illusion of autonomy. The appearance of reason. Advertisers, politicians, cult leaders, and media figures have learned to exploit logic, not by breaking it, but by bending it. They present premises that feel true. Most people are doing this, then link them with a logical consequence, so you should too. The argument works, but it's working off psychological pressure, not truth. A proud figure standing on a tiny podium labeled logic expert, oblivious to a deep abyss of complexity. Oil painting, high contrast, clear central subject, H5C809. Real-world example, political messaging. Political campaigns often craft their messages not around truth, but around narrative coherence. Take this structure: problem gives villain gives solution. Once that structure is in place, logic becomes a tool of persuasion. The economy is bad gives immigrants are taking jobs gives build a wall. The family is breaking down gives moral decay gives return to tradition. People are suffering gives corporations are greedy gives tax the rich. Each uses logic, each feels complete. But their power lies not in facts, but in how the logic resonates with existing emotion. People aren't convinced by logic alone, they're convinced by logic that fits their fears and desires. The rhetorical sleight of hand. Logical fallacies often hide in plain sight, in false dilemmas, straw men, or post hoc reasoning. But if presented confidently, they go unnoticed. In debates, skilled rhetoricians will subtly shift the frame. They'll define the terms in their favor. They'll rephrase your position in a weaker form. They'll use loaded questions that assume guilt or contradiction. These aren't just tricks, they're rational manipulations. They mimic logic to win, not to understand. The algorithm as manipulator. In the digital world, manipulation becomes automated. Algorithms don't reason, they optimize. And what they optimize for is engagement. That means reinforcing your existing beliefs, not challenging them. Here's the paradox. Platforms that feel like open forums for logic and debate are actually personalized echo chambers. They feed you information that makes sense to you. And the more it makes sense, the more confident you become, and the more manipulable. Two figures screaming across a chasm, both holding logic swords, but unable to hear each other over the roar of certainty. Oil painting, high contrast, clear central subject, V6001D, pseudo-data and the authority of numbers. Another tool of rational manipulation is quantification. People tend to trust numbers, they feel objective, but numbers can lie. A graph can mislead by shrinking the y-axis. A statistical correlation can be framed as causation. Averages can conceal outliers. Surveys can be constructed to produce desired results. These manipulations feel logical, but they weaponize the appearance of logic to push an agenda. This is what epistemologists call epistemic laundering, when ideas gain legitimacy not because they're true, but because they look clean. Cognitive vulnerabilities. Psychologists have found that when people are presented with arguments that align with their identity or group, they are less likely to scrutinize the logic. In fact, they often process them faster and remember them more favorably. This is called motivated reasoning, and manipulators exploit it ruthlessly. They wrap lies in the language of logic, and people eat it up because it feels rational. It's not that people are stupid. It's that logic is often a performance, and we're watching for fluency, not truth. Ethical manipulation. There's a darker twist. Some rational manipulation is done with good intentions. A public health campaign might slightly exaggerate risk to encourage safer behavior. A climate activist may present worst-case scenarios as certainty to provoke urgency. A teacher might simplify a complex idea to make it stick, even if it's technically false. These raise an uncomfortable question. Is all rational manipulation wrong? If logic can be used for harm and help, what matters is not the form, but the ethics behind it. Summary of key ideas. Rational manipulation works because logic feels objective and trustworthy. Persuasive structures often disguise emotional manipulation as reason. Algorithms and data can automate large-scale manipulation. People trust logic that fits their identity and ignore logic that doesn't. The ethical danger is not in logic itself, but in how it's used and by whom. Would you like me to move into part 8? Escaping the trap, reason with awareness. We've uncovered logic's dark side, its illusions, its misuses, its manipulations, but this isn't a call to abandon reason. Quite the opposite, it's a call to reclaim it. The solution is not less logic, it's better logic, wiser logic. Logic guided not by the illusion of certainty, but by the discipline of humility. The goal is not to escape rationality, but to escape the trap of unconscious rationality, to reason with awareness. The practice of meta-reasoning. The first step is meta-reasoning, thinking about how you think. This is the core of epistemology. It means asking, where did my assumptions come from? What am I not questioning? Could I be wrong, even if my argument feels solid? This kind of thinking turns logic inward. It watches the watcher. It applies skepticism not only to others' arguments, but to your own. Socrates called this the beginning of wisdom, not to be certain, but to know that you do not know. Logic as a tool, not an identity. Many modern rationalists fall into the trap of identity. They see themselves as logical people, but this creates ego, and ego resists correction. We must remember, logic is a tool, not a virtue in itself. A hammer is useful, but you don't wear it like a badge. You don't defend it when it's the wrong tool for the job. Sometimes life requires other tools: empathy, silence, surrender, intuition. Using logic well means knowing when not to use it. The habit of premise checking. Next, we must learn to check premises constantly. Whenever you hear a logical argument, especially one that seems airtight, ask, is the starting point true? Is it based on data or ideology? Whose interests does this premise serve? This kind of skepticism isn't cynical, it's protective. It keeps us from being lured by flawless reasoning built on flawed ground. Think of it as inspecting the foundation, not just admiring the architecture. Embrace cognitive dissonance. Escaping the logic trap also means getting comfortable with cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when something doesn't make sense or challenges your belief. Most people try to eliminate dissonance by ignoring the contradiction or doubling down. But the wise use dissonance as a signal. It means you've hit a seam in the mental map. It means something deeper is at stake. It means you're getting closer to the roots of your assumptions. Instead of fleeing from dissonance, sit with it. Let it teach you. Integrate emotion and reason. We must also stop treating emotion as the enemy of logic. Emotion doesn't always distort, it often guides. It tells us what matters. It flags moral dimensions that pure reason may overlook. Consider this. A purely logical analysis might justify harmful policies if they optimize for efficiency. Emotion reminds us that human dignity isn't a variable. Ethics requires feeling, not just calculation. Integrating reason and emotion means becoming fully human, thinking with the whole self. Use dialogue, not debate. In debates, logic becomes a weapon. The goal is to win. But in dialogue, the goal is to understand. To reason responsibly, we must shift from adversarial thinking to cooperative inquiry. Instead of asking, "How do I prove I'm right?" ask, "What's true here, even if I'm wrong?" This doesn't mean abandoning rigor. It means directing rigor toward truth, not victory. As philosopher Karl Popper said, the point is not to be right, but to learn why you're wrong. The ladder of reflection. Think of self-aware reasoning as a ladder. Base layer, accepting premises as just how things are. First rung, questioning the source, is this fact, opinion, assumption? Second rung, interrogating the logic, does this conclusion actually follow? Third rung, asking meta questions, who benefits from this logic, what's left out? Top rung, integrating emotion, ethics, and context, is this right, not just correct? Most people live on the first rung, the wise climb higher. Case study, medical ethics, consider medical triage during a crisis. Logic might say, save the most lives possible, but what if one patient is younger, and another has a family relying on them? Raw logic can't decide. Emotion alone can't either. What's needed is judgment, reasoning that respects human value, not just numbers. This is what philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls narrative rationality, logic embedded in human stories. Escaping the trap means learning this richer form of reason. Summary of key practices. Think about how you think meta-reasoning. Treat logic as a tool, not an identity. Regularly inspect your assumptions and premises. Learn from dissonance instead of fleeing it. Integrate emotion with reason for moral clarity. Prefer dialogue to debate, seek understanding, not victory. Practice higher-order reflection, reason with humility and ethics. We've seen that logic can both guide and deceive, that reason, without reflection, can trap us. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? This is the domain of epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. Not just what we know, but how we know, and what we consider worth knowing. In the 21st century, epistemology faces a new landscape, one shaped by machines that think, platforms that polarize, and truths that fracture into algorithms. In this world, the future of logic depends on something ancient and difficult, wisdom, the age of competing rationalities. We no longer live in a world where one kind of logic dominates. Today, multiple rationalities compete. The logic of capitalism, efficiency, growth, competition. The logic of social justice, harm reduction, inclusion, power dynamics. The logic of science, falsifiability, predictability, empirical replication. The logic of faith, trust, meaning, tradition. The logic of emotion, resonance, intuition, aesthetic clarity. Each of these systems makes sense on its own terms. But they often clash, not because they're irrational, but because their starting assumptions differ. This is the modern epistemic crisis, not that people are irrational, but that they reason from incompatible maps. And logic alone can't reconcile these maps. We need a metalogic and epistemological humility that can listen across systems. Logic in the age of AI. Artificial intelligence introduces a new form of logic, machine reasoning. Algorithms now make decisions that affect what news you see, what products you're offered, whether you get hired, approved for a loan, or flagged as a threat. These systems are built on logical operations, data in, prediction out. But that logic is opaque. It's shaped by training data, biases, corporate incentives. And the danger is this: because it's logical, it feels fair. But epistemologists warn us, a logical system is only as good as its inputs and values. Garbage in, garbage out, at scale. As AI grows, the role of epistemology is to ask, who defines truth in these systems? Who benefits from their logic? What is missing from their reasoning? Without these questions, we risk letting machines calcify our biases in code. The rise of choose-your-reality epistemology. In the past, knowledge was scarce. Now, we drown in it. Everyone has access to endless information, and yet, we live in epistemic silos. Social media algorithms feed us the logic we already believe. YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, all create echo chambers of seemingly rational content. This creates confirmation ecosystems where you are surrounded by arguments that make sense. Opposing views feel absurd, even dangerous. Disagreement is not an error, it's heresy. We are no longer arguing facts, we are living in different worlds. Future epistemology must grapple with this, not just how we reason, but who controls the context we reason within. Rationality 2.0 toward experimental thinking. To survive in a post-truth world, logic must evolve into experimental thinking. This means treating beliefs as hypotheses, not dogmas. Testing ideas in dialogue, not defending them blindly. Being willing to risk being wrong to get closer to what's right. This is what Karl Popper envisioned, knowledge not as a fortress, but as a process of constant revision. In this future, the most rational people will be those who change their minds with grace, not those who never change them at all. Epistemic virtues, the new intellectual ethics. The future of logic depends not just on better arguments, but on better habits of mind. Epistemologists now talk about epistemic virtues, traits that support truth-seeking. Intellectual humility, open-mindedness, cognitive empathy, reflective skepticism, willingness to revise. These aren't technical skills, they're character traits. And they must be taught, not through lectures, but through practice, community, and reflection. Logic is powerful, but without virtue, it is dangerous. Education for the age of reasonable doubt. If we want logic to serve us in the future, we need to reimagine how we teach it. Not as a set of rules for winning arguments, not as a checklist for rationality, but as a dialogue with reality, open, iterative, humble. Imagine classrooms that teach fallacies and their emotional appeal. Practice disagreement without polarization, invite uncertainty as a sign of growth. This is education for the age of reasonable doubt. Not certainty, not chaos, but courage in the face of complexity. Summary of key ideas. We now live in a world of competing rationalities, each internally consistent. Logic in AI systems risks concealing bias under the guise of fairness. Personalized information creates echo chambers of rational certainty. Epistemology must embrace experimental thinking, humility, and virtue. Education must focus not just on logic skills, but on epistemic character. We began this journey with a paradox: logic lies, not because it's broken, but because we misuse it, misunderstand it, and sometimes weaponize it. We've seen that reason can liberate, but also blind. It can guide us toward truth, or trap us in illusions that feel true. From Plato to AI, from propaganda to personal bias, logic has been both our torch and our trickster. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. Not between logic and emotion, not between reason and faith, but between unconscious reasoning and self-aware reasoning. Logic is not the destination. Logic is not truth. It is a path toward truth, but only if we're careful about where we begin, how we walk it, and who we trust to lead us. It must be grounded in truthful premises, honest intentions, ethical awareness, willingness to be corrected. Logic, by itself, does not guarantee wisdom, it merely creates structure. But wisdom knows when to question that structure and when to step outside it. Logic with a conscience. What we need is a logic with a conscience. A way of thinking that's not just sharp, but kind. Not just valid, but responsible. This means developing intellectual humility, knowing what you don't know. Epistemic compassion, understanding why others believe what they believe. Cognitive flexibility, willingness to revise beliefs when evidence demands it, reflective rigor, constantly checking not just your conclusions, but your process. These aren't limitations of logic, they are its evolution. Why it matters now, in a world of deepfakes, AI-generated arguments, custom-filtered realities, sophisticated persuasion campaigns. The danger is no longer ignorance, it's false certainty. It's people who sound rational while selling you a lie. It's manipulation dressed in logic's clothing. We can't stop these forces by yelling louder or citing more facts. We stop them by becoming the kind of thinkers who cannot be easily fooled, even by ourselves. This is the new literacy, the new virtue, the new responsibility. Cultivating a better epistemology. Imagine a culture where students learn to doubt their first impressions. Algorithms are judged not just by efficiency but by epistemic fairness. Public discourse prizes curiosity over confidence. Leaders are measured by how they change their minds, not just how they stay the course. This is not utopian. It's a shift in how we define intelligence, success, and truth itself. We don't need perfect logic. We need aware logic. We don't need everyone to agree. We need people willing to stay in the room when they disagree, to reason together as if the truth matters more than victory. Final truths. Let's end with a few final reflections. Logic is not the enemy, but blind trust in logic is. The greatest manipulations are often the most reasonable. Truth is not what sounds good, it's what survives the test of scrutiny and doubt. Epistemology is not a game of intellectual dominance, it's a lifelong discipline of humility, courage, and care. So the next time an argument sounds perfectly logical, pause. Ask where it begins, ask who benefits. Ask what's being left out. And the next time you feel certain, pause again. Not to doubt yourself into paralysis, but to stay open. Stay human, stay honest. This is what it means to reason well. This is what it means to trust logic without being trapped by it.